It's now time to open actually the first panel discussion. We will have 2 sessions this afternoon. Microphones, so after the panel discussion, if you wish to ask a question, please raise your hands. A microphone will be brought to you. Our first panel will be moderated by Patti Bruns, Secretary General of the Arctic Mayors Forum. Prior to working at the Arctic Mayors Forum, Patti was at the Canadian International Arctic Centre, where she served as Senior Policy Advisor. She also held the position of Executive Secretary of 2 Arctic Council working groups, namely the Arctic Contaminant Action Programme and the Emergency Prevention, Preparedness and Response Working Group, Patti. Patti will be moderating a panel that will reflect now on the aspirations from the Norwegian and the Kingdom of Denmark Arctic Council Chairships. The panel will highlight what the Norwegian Arctic Council Chairship has been able to achieve in spite of the current geopolitical situation, and what the Kingdom of Denmark Chairship will carry on when it takes over in 2025. Patti, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I'm just going to ask my panelists to make their way to the stage, please. So Morten, Sara, Naja-Theresia, and Tobias. While they do that, I'll just start the panel. We're a little behind schedule. I promise not to keep you too long from coffee, but we are going to take the time that we need to do this great opening session. So yes, my name is Patti Bruns, and really it is my honor to welcome you all to this opening panel discussion of the Arctic Futures Symposium, where you will explore the Arctic Council's enduring role as the cornerstone of Arctic cooperation. The Arctic Council is alive and thriving. Despite the challenges of our time, it continues to be a model of collaboration, uniting member states, Arctic indigenous peoples, and observers in a shared commitment to the sustainable development and well-being of the Arctic. Norway's chairship has been a testament to this resilience, making meaningful progress on priorities such as youth engagement, wildland fire management, emergency preparedness, and addressing urgent priorities like climate change and ocean health. But what is next? As the Kingdom of Denmark prepares to assume leadership in May 2025, we'll hear about their early vision on building this work while shaping their own legacy. We'll also hear about the role of Indigenous people and young people, really the heart of this collaboration, to understand what's most important for Arctic communities moving forward. Joining me today are Morten Høglund, current chair of the Senior Arctic Officials, Tobias Elling Rehfeld, SAO for the Kingdom of Denmark. I hope I said your name right, did I? Close enough. Sara Olsvig, the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and Naja-Theresia Høegh, a law student and board member of AVALAK, the Greenlandic Student Association for Greenlandic students living in Denmark. And you can all read their detailed bios in the conference materials. Together, we're going to reflect on the successes, priorities, and plans ahead for the Arctic Council. I encourage you to listen actively and to start jotting down some questions. I will try to open the floor a little bit towards the end. I will already entreat you to keep your questions and not comments. Let's get started. Morten, I'm going to put you on the spot right off the bat. When we were discussing this panel and I asked what you wanted to get across to the audience, the first point was the Arctic Council is alive. Can you elaborate on this statement and what it means to you, and what key indicators would you say really demonstrate that the Arctic Council is vital and alive?
Live, yeah, that can be different levels of aliveness. But since we met here a year ago, at that time, we were in still a very much discussion phase internally. We started some initiatives from the chairship on the wildland fire. We had something going, but there was still a little uncertainty on how to move the actual work forward. So we were in a consultation mode internally. But with good progress, and there were good signs, and Sara Olsvig pointed to the declaration or the statement from last year, 2023, when all 8 states and 6 indigenous peoples organizations jointly said they want to safeguard the council and strengthen it. So there was a willingness. And we all wanted to see the good work in the working groups coming back again. And in February, we were able to get consensus on opening the working groups for actual meetings. And that was that was the big game changers, sort of. And this fall, this past months, all the working groups have been holding their plenary meetings, big meetings with observers and so on. There is a number of people involved in these meetings, and we see the activities and the optimism and in fact, what I get reported, joy of being back together again. Because some of these people have been working together for 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. They're experts in their fields. They're leading experts. And to be able to get back into the project, design new projects, and there's so much going on that I'm even sometimes taken back a little bit because, wow, this is positive. So on that level, it's really functioning well. So we have a way to go in terms of the whole organization. It's not business as usual, and for good reasons. But on the level of the working groups, it's really a lot is happening, and that's thanks to everyone involved.
Thanks for that, Morten. And I will say that as a former executive secretary, the meeting of the working groups and having that energy together, it is really the backbone of the Arctic Council, and it comes back to something that the state secretary mentioned, which is knowledge creation and pushing the understanding of what's happening in the Arctic further. So Tobias, picking up on this and recognizing that plans are still being developed for the Kingdom of Denmark Chairship and not wanting to stymie any progress being made in the Norwegian Chairship, but what are some of the focus areas that you kind of suspect the Kingdom of Denmark will continue on? Or alternatively, what are sort of some of the pressing challenges that you plan on taking on in 2025? May 12th, 2025, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. No, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us. And of course, I should underline that, yeah, it is the Kingdom of Denmark. It is Greenland, Faroe Islands, and Denmark working very closely together to plan and implement this chairship. I'm very happy to see some of my Greenlandic and Faroese friends in the audience today, because this is very much a collaborative effort. And there's a political decision in the kingdom that Greenland will be playing a leading role in our chairship, and we're looking very much forward to joining up and following the good work of Norway. And I think just on this discussion on being alive, not to quote any big hits from the 70s, but for people who are not been involved, this is. What we're looking at is basically the Arctic Council as a merry little minivan driving on the road, and suddenly someone put a bricks wall right in front of it, and you drive into that wall. And of course, the wall is the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so Morten and his team have been mechanics here. They've been putting this bus together again, putting the wheels on, putting the steering gear back in order, reconfiguring the GPS, and maybe the bus looks a little scratched and bumpy, and maybe it's not driving as fast as it did before, but it is driving. And I think our biggest responsibility as chairship following Norway is to ensure that the bus keeps driving. We know already that there's a lot of demands now for what more can we do? How can we develop the organization? How can we be a good shepherd of all the good intentions that are in the organization? And I think that's not to underplay the chairship program that is almost done in a draft, and we've been working very hard for the last year, Greenland, Faroe Island and Denmark, to ensure that we have a good draft. But that's really not the essential part of the chairship. The essential part is to enable all the good work being done in the working groups, to enable the participation of the PPs, to ensure that the observer states and the member states can put real and good work into the work of the organization, and we are not paralyzed by what has happened in Ukraine. And of course, that being said, we have a number of excellent chairship points coming up. We will focus on sustainable development in the Arctic for the people and indigenous peoples living in the Arctic, on oceans, climate change, on a number of topics that are already very known in the organization, but where we, of course, will try to not only put political attention to these, but arrange events, conferences, workshops, and so on, to ensure that we, as Arctic states, observers, permanent participants, have a place to meet and discuss some of these important issues. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And I think that I know myself, at least, I'm really looking forward to getting together underneath the umbrella of the Arctic Council again. That has certainly been missing. Sara, I want to turn to you now. Thank you very much for an inspiring keynote speech. Looking at the Arctic Council, though, what are the recent achievements under the Norwegian chairship that you think really stand out and are beneficial for Indigenous communities? And how would you like to see those efforts being carried forward?
Well, I would first and foremost like to say, and thank you both as the SAOs and the senior Arctic officials of this great cooperation, that you're highlighting the different roles that you take when you are chairing the Arctic Council. And I think it's been the multitasking abilities, Morten and others, to be able to not just repair the bus, but you also be the driver and be the one who welcomes everyone into the bus and the one who gives the direction to which way to take and so forth. And that is a task that will continue into the next incoming chairship. And we are from the Inuit Circumpolar Council ready to contribute and support that effort. And as I said, we really do look to that as a task that will be solved in a good way in the next 2 coming years. To those who are more Arctic Council nerds, I just also want to say that you, of course, all know the rules of procedure of the Arctic Council, and this is an excellent example of on how we, on one hand, have a very unique governance structure built around how we are in the Arctic. That the Arctic is not the Arctic without the Arctic indigenous peoples. The Arctic Council is not the Arctic Council without the Arctic indigenous peoples. And embracing that from the Norwegian chairship has really been something that has stood out for me. If we look at the rules of procedure, it talks about rights of consultation. If we look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that came after the establishment of the Arctic Council, consultation is so last year, seriously. Now it's about participation in decision making. It's the recognition of the rights of the self-determination. It's recognizing that we inherently exercise our right of self-determination just by living in the Arctic. And I really want to commend the Arctic Council Chairship for taking this time not to sort of go into this in a way where we could have risked some of the de facto and some of the ways of working that already existed prior to the so-called pause. If somebody had gone to this task saying, well, it only says consultation, it would have been a step back. Because what indigenous peoples and the permanent participants have done, together with the states, is to form ways of working where we take part in the decision-making, where no decisions are taken without our voices being integral to that decision. So that's what we need to build on going ahead. And it's always risky to say that somebody is not following the rules of procedure, but we are. We are interpreting them, as I see it, in a way that upholds the promises of the rights that have been affirmed at other venues globally, and bringing them into the Arctic Council. And that's actually a strengthening, if we look at it. And I want to highlight that as something that, of course, needs to continue. Rønner.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sara, for that. We're going to turn now to Naja-Theresia. Thank you so much for being with us today. You're with us because youth engagement has really been a focal point for the Norwegian Chairship. And in fact, I think the first big Arctic Council branded event of a long time is coming up in January at the Arctic Council Youth Conference in Tromsø. But I'm really interested to hear from you, Naja-Theresia, from both your personal and professional experience. What is the best way to ensure that young voices are heard and that they're really meaningfully integrated into Arctic governance structures?
Thank you for the question. And I'm first really honored to be sitting here with all of you. And I'm very proud that you also decided to invite youth to participate in these sessions. I think first, there has been an increase in youth participation, and I have definitely felt it as well. But of course, that said, I think we also need to start talking about how youth inclusion can both be beneficial for youth, but also for policymakers. We need to somehow have a discussion on how do we make sure that policymakers are actually having a dialogue when youth are invited. Usually the youth are put at the very end of the agenda of the plan, and in that way we don't get to have the dialogue that we came here for. And in that way, I think we really need to hear from policymakers as well of how do we actually ensure that policymakers listen and can have a dialogue with us, and how would they like to how would they like to be approached by youth when we are participating here? And youth inclusion is not only relevant for just youth, but it's also relevant for the policymakers who are forming policies that are going to directly impact the youth who aren't here. And sometimes I think it's a relevant discussion to have also in other Arctic governances of how would you like to be approached by youth, and how do we make sure that when we are inviting youth that it's both good for the policymakers who are invited, but also for the youth who are attending. I think that was my comment.
I think that's a really great point. It is very important to have that open dialogue about how information should be received, and also how it should be implemented and taken forward. So I like that. I think we have a theme for 2026, EU Arctic Youth Dialogue. We're going to turn now to a moderated discussion, keeping an eye on the time a little bit. But first, we're going to have a chat amongst the panelists, and then I will open the floor a little bit. Morten, you sort of previewed that working groups are very busy right now working on deliverables. I remember December's very well. Can you preview some of the deliverables that we might see coming forward for approval, or at least some of the big topics and priorities that you can kind of put a check mark beside?
Well, when we took over the chairship, or when we were planning the chairship, of course, there was so much uncertainty, but we still lined up some priority areas which we wanted, and we are now structuring the last phase of our chairship and the documents we want to put on the tables for the PPs and the states to decide on along these topics: climate, environment, ocean, people in the north, sustainable economic development. And we are tasking the working groups to come up with and they've already delivered their zero draft documents, and the PPs and the states are also coming with their input. So we are well in the process now. I am not... some topics have been mentioned here, and this is... what we are discussing in the Arctic Council and in the Arctic, it's very transparent, and it's very, you know, we're not inventing the wheel. We're not trying to. It's written in the strategic plan, but what we're trying to do, and where I think the Arctic Council has always been good, and where we must make sure that we continue to stay relevant, is that we tackle emerging issues and important issues for the people in the Arctic, for the global communities, that we are on top of these issues, and so that's where I have high hopes that we will now be guiding the working groups and the council in the future. We have this year been celebrating 20 years since the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment Report came out, which was a groundbreaking. It was really the Arctic informed the global community about the state of affairs in the Arctic regarding climate change. It was also a co-production between indigenous stakeholders and leading scientists from all over, in a way that is used as an example today of how we should work together. Trying to, you know, when we look back at our history, we have a lot to be proud of, but we're not going to rest on these laurels. It's just taking that and building on it. And that's what I see with the energy now in the working groups. And that goes, yes, on climate, but it goes on marine environment, a lot of things, good activities. And of course, we need to be able to address the challenges in the communities in the north. The people, we have to be people-centered. We are a council consisting of states representing people in the Arctic, and with a stroke of genius of the founding mothers and fathers of this organization, indigenous people were front and center. And I've been looking at some of the interviews of Governor General Mary Simon, who was a key person in designing this organization, and her vision for this. And that's, I think, an inspiration of how we, who are in the front of this now, can take this forward. So without trying to go too much deep into the substance, I think we're going to see a lot of good things coming. And then, of course, it's always difficult to get 8 states and 6 indigenous peoples organizations to agree on everything. But I think we have a good foundation and a good position to get good work done.
Yes, Røyana. Yes, there's been more work than many may imagine. And I think that's also, again, because of what was already said, that the working groups consist of, you know, tens and tens of experts who are just really the experts on their own areas, and then also including the knowledge of indigenous peoples, which we are still pushing to have a stronger position of in the work of the Arctic Council. And on that note, I want to say that this is a magnificent time to change the ways that the Arctic Council decides on projects, for example. It's been like so that you have to bring the money to be able to initiate a project. This has kept indigenous peoples from proposing projects because we couldn't bring the money. Or we had to partner with someone who would then have a say over the production of the research design, or even the research question, or the design of the project, and leaving that into hands of others. So this is a magnificent time to strengthen the council internally, to bring it back to its original spirit and intent, which Morten so also eloquently was talking about. And in spite of these challenges, and in spite of the so-called pause, we have been seeing improvement and activities. And I want to especially personally highlight, I wasn't even there in person, but the effects of having the 3rd International Conference on Ecosystem-Based Management and focus on the marine environment and marine governance was so important, because that's where we are also seeing development in the Arctic, not just because of the climate and environmental changes, but also because because of the governance changes of how we work with our own self-governing bodies and so forth. The work under the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna Working Group on Circumpolar biodiversity monitoring programs and coastal projects. The work under Sustainable Development Working Group, which is also challenged, but where we have the work on mental health in the Arctic, where we have to work on suicide prevention among Arctic indigenous youth, where we have the work on gender equality, which needs to be expanded to include also the systemic discrimination against indigenous women. So we have so much work ahead of us, but we have a very strong foundation that we can build on.
Go ahead, Tobias.
Thanks a lot. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to jump in here. My
Of course
good people
you are.
wrote, listen to what Sara and Morten says and not.
Okay,
nodding.
perfect.
I'm agreeing. But just to say one thing, the nightmare scenario for the Kingdom of Denmark Chairship would be that we entered this role with no active projects in the working groups. And there was a feeling, there was a point where the chilling effect was quite significant. And therefore, I'm extremely happy for the work that's been done to re-engage and re-indict the work in the working groups. And we've spent quite a lot of time internally, Denmark, Greenland, Faroe Islands, and our research space to discuss how can we put more projects in there? How can we bring more activity in there? So it's just also for the group, those of you who have spare funds, don't hesitate. There's actually a full political commitment to get this work up and running again. There are some very, very tricky political balances that we have to get right. They're extremely tricky. But that doesn't mean that the work in the working groups cannot continue. So it's just, and then also to what Naja-Theresia is saying, I think it's extremely important that we have youth in these discussions, not just to be in the discussions, because but to have very substantive points on the substance of what we're discussing. So we have to move beyond just being there. We have to be into the quality of what is the specific perspective of youth. And Naja-Theresia is very good at that, so I'm happy. Thanks.
That's great. There's so many red threads to pick up here. I would like to pick up on something that Sara said, and that's on mental health and well-being, and that is something that we are definitely hearing also through our members in the Arctic Mayors Forum, that this is a huge priority, and this is our strategic priority as well during the chairship of the Kingdom of Denmark, in our case Greenland, to really work together with partners, including the Arctic Council, on how to address some of these issues, which I think also include youth right from the very beginning. So really looking forward to that work. And then Morten and Tobias, you gave me a perfect entree into my next question, which is actually about how big is the minibus, because we have to get observers in there as well. And observer engagement has been a topic of discussion in the Arctic Council for a long time. We're sitting here in Brussels with many of the observer representatives in the room. And I'm wondering how observers are being re-engaged in the work of the council, how that's actually taking place, and what's being done to make sure those channels stay open for the rest of the Norwegian chairship and also into the Kingdom of Denmark.
Yeah, that's one of several concerns I have, and absolutely it's very easy to admit that as an observer, you can feel a little, we are not at the stage yet where they can fully engage. Having them at the table or on the Zoom link, if you say, again, in the working group meetings, you can say that's some success, but then again, it is virtual. So it just carries you so far. So I think the real work of the observers is through their experts and participants in the projects. And of course they have, when they are participating in a project, they're participating on an equal basis. And we've had a number of workshops and activities, also some of them in person, There have been workshops happening all over the Arctic, but also there was not long ago one in China on migratory birds. So these things are happening. So it depends a little where you're sitting in the observer universe. Then again, for state observers, the last 2 years we've had meeting with, we invited all of them to Poland, thanks to Polish MFA for facilitating this, been meeting them, that's been great. At Arctic Frontiers in Tromsø, we make sure to invite all observers to come and meet with us. We provide a hybrid and a physical possibilities to meet. So, and of course, bilaterally, we're always there to meet. And then we have a long list of countries and organizations who are not yet observers, or I don't know if they will be or want to be, but who want to engage with us. And we try to be as transparent, as open as we can, and build connections and network and facilitate those, because there's a lot of opportunities to connect on the actual work within the council. So there are limits to how many can sit around the meeting table. But if you want to connect on a climate project, renewable energy, or a shipping activity, there's a lot of opportunities if you have people who want to contribute. So that kind of facilitation. So we use a lot of energy and time on this as well. But I do admit that there's still, because we do not have the SAO meetings going on, so the MFA traditional contact, it's not happening as it used to do.
It does sound like there's a bit of an opening there, though, for observers to get involved as experts in the projects and the work of the council.
And I encourage, and I know also the chairs of the working group, to reach out to observers, to keep the line of communication open. And I know many of the working groups have been doing great work in also creating observer manuals. How do observers be a part of activities? So there is a lot of good work to be done, but this is a continuous effort.
Naja-Theresia, I'm going to pull you into this conversation. We talk about how observers can engage, and one of the things I'm wondering from your experience in working with youth and governance and being heard, what do you think the Arctic Council could do to make sure that youth participation is actually integrated into decision making?
I think one of the ways that we could integrate more of youth involvement is actually creating positions for youth, for example, ambassador positions or advisor positions and so on, so that we actually get a representative of youth in the Arctic governance systems. We see too little youth representatives in the same levels of officials, so it could be incredibly a big step if we also started taking sort of a trust in youth to take those type of positions. I think also one of the ways that we could also ensure that we have a better youth inclusivity is also to take reach to the marginalized youth that we have. For Greenland, for instance, we have youth from settlements and smaller towns that we don't ever hear anything about. And when we talk about the Arctic, we usually talk about climate change and all of that, but the people and the youth who are actually being affected the most, we don't hear from. Of course, we're all being affected by climate change in the communities, but the marginalized youth, we don't know how climate change is affecting them. So it could be great to have some kind of official in some kind of instance, so that they also can take contact to marginalized youth and the minorities in our countries. Also quite important to also have inclusion of the indigenous people in any aspect in the Arctic governance systems, also indigenous youth representatives, if it's possible. I think that would be my biggest suggestion.
Yeah, Sara, how does ICC include youth? Because I know that ICC is very active in youth engagement. So how do you include youth in the conversations around the Arctic Council?
Rønner. We work in 4-year terms, and in the previous term, 2018 to 22, we had an Emerging Leaders Initiative where we had a relatively large group of youth from all over Inuit Nunat who worked throughout the term and came up with a report with recommendations which we are now implementing. And some of these recommendations was to further engage youth and also create toolkits for them on how to engage on the international arena, including in the Arctic Council. So this is our youth engagement program. And thank you to the North Atlantic pool of money that the Danish Parliament set aside to us for this program to run this year and next year. We still lack funding for 26, where we plan a youth summit. I don't see any nodding now. But this program is designed based on the recommendations that the emerging leaders came up with, and we were directed by our General Assembly to implement. And we've had an open call. We took the step and did an actual open call, and we had nearly 200 applicants from across Inuit Nunat. And right now we are in the process. We're actually waiting for the last replies from our Alaska branch today to confirm those youth who will be part of this engagement program. And I want to thank again the Norwegian Chairship program, because we do have the SAO Chair PP meetings, the SAO Chair permanent participant meetings. And when we started to implement, before even starting our youth engagement program, we wanted to bring youth to these SAO Chair PP meetings, and the chairship were able to accommodate that we could have youth with us. And at the last SAO Chair PP meeting in Bodø, I believe that there were quite a lot of youth from different permanent participants there at the table, part of the dialogue. And again, these are actually meetings happening under the Arctic Council, and we are able to hold them because we are peoples of the Arctic, and we are able to uphold the promise of the joint statement on people-to-people cooperation.
I was sharing that meeting, and in the beginning, it was just a plan to have the youth speak at certain, agenda items. And then I don't know if it was Sara or someone said, let the youth participate, throughout the whole. Okay, and as a chair, you like everything to be planned, orderly, and things, But I think, okay, that's nice. And the dynamic of the meeting was so great, but it changed the debate as well. And new aspects and new ideas came on the table, and it was touching, moving, exciting. And so, what that youth engagement brought to that meeting, I think I still will look at that as one of the highlights of the chairship, looking back. So that's what you get when you invite youth for real participation, and not only tokenism, but you bring them into the discussion fully. So I can only recommend to the next chairship to try and something similar, and even do it more. So that's a great experience, and we hope to also copy this in the few months we have left.
Well, we're going to turn to a tips and tricks question at the end of the panel. So hopefully you have a few more in your back pocket to share with Tobias. But I'm going to open the floor now for a couple of questions before turning back to the panel for some last words. Does anybody please put up your hand if you have a question for the panel? If not, I will just keep asking questions. So don't be shy. Okay, Anita. Yep. Microphone is coming to you.
Remarkable gathering, thank you. On the youth question, is there a connection also between, I think there's been an out-migration number of persons, and I don't know what the age range is, but does it relate to that aspect as well, that people can talk about what needs to be developed and how they fit into it and how they define it and shape it, and that's the future? Is that part of it? Thank you.
Go ahead.
So the question was if they can be a part of solving the problems. Am I understanding your question correct?
That's part of the conversation.
I think the question is, how is out-migration of youth impacting the conversation about keeping youth in communities, and when you lose them, how do you bring them back? Is that part of the agenda and part of the conversation that's happening?
I hope so. I think when we bring youth together, we're definitely going to talk more about how centralization, for example, is affecting the mental health of youth across the Arctic. And I'm really glad that Sara brought mental health up, because it can be a really difficult subject for us to bring up. Mental health is affecting mostly youth from the ages of 15 to 34 years old. So when we are talking about how do we solve these problems, also if you want a prosperous Arctic, then we need to include the youth in how we're going to solve mental health problems, which I think has a big correlation with immigration or migration to other cities because of centralization and all of that. So I hope it's going to be a bigger topic for hopefully the next Arctic Council, and maybe bringing Arctic indigenous people and youth together to talk about mental health problems.
Tobias, do you want to? Has there been a discussion, or when you're reaching out to stakeholders, developing the chairship, is there further discussions on how to integrate young voices into the council or into the working groups? Or is this still sort of an emerging issue that hasn't sort of been grappled with yet?
Well, first of all, I think I should say, the chairship program is a fairly small and condensed general thing, as you all know. So there's just a limit to how much you put into the chairship program in itself, because yes, the chairship has the responsibility to bring political attention to some specific issues, but again, the most important work is actually done in the working groups as things are right now. So, but yes, youth is actually, we had discussions between Norway, the Kingdom of Denmark, and Sweden. You have the 3 Nordic chairships in a row, and there's a full agreement that youth and bringing in youth will be a shared priority. So we can have that as a priority for 6 years in a row, and hopefully that that will enable us to bring more quality into that specific issue. So, and yes, youth will be a priority for us as well. But I think building on the work that has already been done by Norway.
Yeah, I think it's really good to have that 6-year perspective, and to start working also with other stakeholders who are also really engaging in that youth space, and with, of course, youth themselves, about how to be heard and to have that sort of 360-degree feedback on what works. I know we do have a question here in the front, and then one at the back as well.
Thank you very much, Patti. Thank you very much for all of you for this insightful presentation. My name is Arthur Amlot. I am currently the trainee at INSPA B3, so the units in charge of Greenland dossier. But the question will not be under this hat, but under my former hat as a kind of participant within the OSPAR Arctic Outcome Working Groups. And I know that there's been some talking with the Arctic Council and with the ICC Greenland in order to include them. So I would just use this question to ask you first, where are we at right now? And second, what's through the Arctic Council, Norwegian Chairmanship and Danish Chairmanship, if there will be more interinstitutional will to cooperate forwards on, for example, Arctic waters in the case of OSPAR Arctic Outcome Committee, but also with other institutions that have other agenda. Thank you very much. I hope I've been cleared.
Sara?
Yes, I was fortunate to be at the meeting in Nuuk a few months ago on the Oslo-Paris convention cooperation, and the excellent idea that the states taking part in that has now also conveyed to have indigenous peoples participate in the work of the OSPAR. And I think that brought us a little bit closer to a common understanding of how such a participation should look, upholding of course, the rights affirmed under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which all members of OSPAR also have endorsed. So we are looking to that with good intentions and good hopes for the states involved to find a solution that makes it meaningful for us to participate in the work. I think some of the challenges will be that OSPAR works with a larger area than the Arctic, and the question will be, like we do in international fora in the UN, we also work, for example, on the plastics negotiations, on the climate negotiations, on biodiversity and so forth, or IMO, for example. We do not limit ourselves only to the Arctic, because what goes on outside of the Arctic affects us in the Arctic. So I think that will be an issue to solve for OSPAR also, to see how we can do that. But this actually brings me to one of the challenges that we do have, and I think we have to talk more about it, and that's the capacity issue. For us, it was really difficult to build the capacity to have the level of engagement in the working groups now under the restart of the work, because we had lost some funding, we had lost people during the so-called pause. And to build that capacity as Arctic Indigenous Peoples organizations is a bit of a challenge. I want to thank all the funders who have actually funded us, including, of course, both the parliaments of Greenland and Denmark, but also other private funders and some of the observer organizations as well. But we need to continue to build that capacity so that it doesn't become tokenistic, as was also mentioned at some point. We need to avoid that to make it meaningful. And that also, of course, goes in OSPAR. But then we need not just to have the seat, but also to have support, to have staff to do these files on an everyday basis so that we can truly contribute. Rønner.
I've enjoyed having the conversation with OSPAR and participated in OSPAR meeting, and we've shared experiences, and I'm happy that OSPAR representatives will come to Tromsø to meet us at the Arctic Frontiers, and we will continue this discussion. And I just saw an email today from our PAM working group lining up some OSPAR-related activity. I haven't had time to read it. So I know there are, and the main actual substantive work or activity or looking at how we can is dealt with by PAM, which is the respective working group for marine environment. So I don't have the all the details on this, but I know the dialogue is ongoing. But it's one of these issues where I think we could have a more strategic overview, and that's where the council is not at the moment functioning at the best. You know, we still have a little way to go, and that goes for many international organizations where the council overlaps in responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks for that. We're going to take one last question, and then I'm going to turn back to the panel for some final thoughts. There's a question from Naja-Theresia.
Hi. So I live in Bodø. I work in a development company. And a lot of the things that the Arctic Council do is make guidelines on how to develop things and invest in the Arctic, both for us that lives there, but also for investors coming in. And now that Tobias mentioned it, the geopolitical situation changed some stuff. Have you worked on the scenario that Russia is building their own Arctic Council and how they want to kind of develop the Arctic and the guidelines? How do you work around that when they have a break from this Arctic Council?
Yeah, I'm getting it from you.
There was a throwing of the microphone.
I think if I were a politician, I would say I wouldn't want to answer hypothetical questions because Russia is still very much part of the Arctic Council. I think it's fair to say that with curtain downs, we are thinking through all scenarios, but that's not the scenario we are aiming for here. We're aiming for a scenario where Arctic Council consists of all the 8 Arctic states, and that we find ways of working together among the states, with the permanent participants, with the governments of in all the different countries that are in the region. We don't have a plan B as such. We have a plan A. And of course, part of that plan is how do we focus on sustainable economic development in the Arctic? How do we ensure a more coordinated and closer north-to-north cooperation? I think it's fair to say that with Greenland in a leading role in the Kingdom's chairship and the Naja-Theresia, the Greenlandic government's focus on sustainable economic development, this will be a key priority for us to put attention to, opportunities for investments, job creation, and so on in the region. But of course, so much work has already been done. I don't think we can reinvent or something entirely new. But there are a number of areas that we can bring focus on. It's the geopolitical difficulties that Morten and his team has been faced with. We will be faced with exactly the same complications. And we will also have a new administration in the US with new policies that we are not entirely sure how they will play out. So we will have plenty to talk about in a year's time when we sit here.
Well, it's a good thing that the Arctic Council is alive and thriving, and that it is working at 8 with 6 permanent participants, which includes, of course, Russian indigenous people as well. So I think that's very important. Before final thoughts, Morten, what are your tips and tricks for the incoming Kingdom of Denmark Chairship?
I think they know how to deal with this. It's but transparency is key. And, whatever you say in any meeting, everyone will know immediately. So telling the same story everywhere, and that's what we do. And on the last question, I've always said, being a member part of the Arctic Council, it must be meaningful for everyone who takes part, being an indigenous organization or a state. If they don't find it meaningful, they will leave. So we have to make sure, if you're sharing this organization, that you don't discriminate. You give opportunities for everyone. And then, yes, there are challenges, and you just have to listen and try to understand and take a back seat and try to understand what's Washington and Moscow and Reykjavik and Stockholm's concerns, and then try to find a way forward. That's the fun of it.
Well, you have done so expertly, Morten, so congratulations to you and your team and of course, your support at the Arctic Council Secretariat. Final thoughts from you, Sara?
Well, I'll see if they nod again. We are aspiring together with the Sami Council to have a high-level Arctic Indigenous Peoples Health Dialogue, hopefully as a Kingdom of Denmark Chairship event, hopefully fully planted to continue year after year in the Sustainable Development Working Group. And I think those are some of the examples, and this is now funded in the preparation phase, led by the Sami Council with the support of us and others, to have a new beginning in terms of bringing the agenda of indigenous peoples into the core of the work of the Arctic Council again. And I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I really do think that that is an important endeavor to embrace as the current chairship and the incoming chairships will face that sort of new way of working as not an obstacle or something that we need to do because because we have indigenous peoples taking part, but because that's what we need in the Arctic. That's what we need to make our lives not more meaningful, but make the work that we do in the Arctic Council more meaningful, as it was said. Because I think that as Naja-Theresia said, a lot of the youth and a lot of the people in our own communities, they sometimes feel that the Arctic Council is very far away. So for us to be able to build on those initiatives and wishes that are on the ground in the communities, and to translate that into what will we gain from working together on that. I always like to highlight the solid waste management project, which is one of the only projects we are not, one of the only working groups we are not part of in ICC, and that's simply because of capacity issues on the ACAP. But it makes so much sense, because all of us across the Arctic have an issue with solid waste management. But we need to take a look at the 6 working groups, 5 of which are so fully focused on environment, climate, on these things that are a bit cold outside of our lives. And then 1 working group, Sustainable Development Working Group, that goes into the core of human beings, human lives in the Arctic, and expand on that in this next term. I think that's the next step that the Arctic Council needs to take to make it meaningful for all of us who live in the Arctic. Rønner.
Naja-Theresia.
Yeah, I think it's more of a suggestion to keep continuing the youth participation and evolving more on that, and making sure that policymakers are also gaining from youth participation, and that it's not only youth gaining from youth participation themselves. And of course, the #1 thing that I would probably suggest that to do is, of course, to have the biggest focus on mental health, because we are losing generations from suicides in Greenland, and also in Nunavut also, and there's mental health issues across the Arctic that mean that we're seeing less innovations in the Arctic, we're seeing less workforce that would be of interest of you, we're seeing less youth who are getting educated because of mental health problems, and we need to have a big focus on that, and I'm happy that Sara mentions that they would like to, and hopefully will have this arrangement on, and have a focus on health in the Arctic, which is a big step forward. So I hope that there will be an ongoing focus on youth participation.
Thank you. Tobias.
Well, first of all, I wish we had a worse chair right now, because that would make it a little bit easier for us to step in. But since that's not the case, no, we are really looking forward to this, and we are working very closely together, Greenland, Faroe Islands, and Denmark, to be the best we can be, and to take up this responsibility in a very serious and professional way. I hope that we will have easier working conditions than Morten, but I don't think so. And therefore, we will probably be in quite a few situations where we would kind of think, what would Norway do? And at least I can sort of guarantee that all the meetings that the Norwegian Chairship has been establishing and so on to navigate, we will do the same thing. So that is a promise. We don't, being it with the permanent participants, with the observers, with the member states, we will try to do the same. And then hopefully I hope we can spice it up with a number of very interesting events, not necessarily in Denmark, but in Faroe Islands and in Greenland. And if I can make just a little commercial, the new international airport in Nuuk just opened on Thursday, and I was there, and it was such a joyful event. So hopefully we can use the infrastructure, the possibilities to bring Arctic to the world, and the world to Arctic, and we have international airports to support it. Thank you.
Very exciting. Over to you, Morten. We need a tweet, or a blue sky, whatever we're calling it these days.
Well, I think I give my advice and how these things. I think there's a great future here, and I've this fall, this past month, I've conducted consultations. I have one PP organization left, or otherwise I met with all the states and I met with the other PPs. And again, I mentioned the optimism from the working group, but I also feel the optimism from the states. And I met so many members of working groups also in the states. I've been traveling, I've been meeting them online, and that energy. And I met the new Russian SAO on Friday, and he with his team. And yes, you can say that's a little absurd setting, and it is in certain ways. But the commitment to the Arctic Council is as strong as ever. So I don't, as long as we stay focused on the issues, and the issues has been raised here. The past issues, issues like mental health, waste management, concrete issues, which are relevant to the stakeholders, to the people, to the industry, to everyone who lives and operates within the Arctic. We have a future, and interacting, and being in Brussels. We have been, the European interest in cooperating has been so great. I mentioned the Wildland Fire Initiative. I want to, my final is to thank EU, Poland, Spain, but also others who have come to the table to provide real knowledge and expertise in working with us, sharing their experience from combating wildland fires, and how we do it in the Arctic, in terms of capacity, knowledge on preparedness management. And for those who have not listed in the calendar and want to know more about emergency preparedness in the Arctic, there's a conference in Bodø, 18th to 20th of March, where wildland fire will be one topic, but also health preparedness, search and rescue issues, and all those issues which communities and people in the Arctic are faced with. Flooding, extreme weather, and so on. Making sure that communities are linked to the greater world, and we have resources in tackling everything. So that was probably more than you asked for.
That's perfect. And I've heard the word communities many times, which also, of course, is near and dear to my heart. So thank you for this. I do feel there is a sense of optimism with the Arctic Council. I do think that the minibus is not as battered and bruised as it could have been, and for that we're grateful to the Norwegian Chairship for its expert guidance and look forward to the future. Please, everybody, join me in thanking our esteemed panelists on this first session.